The history of the Battle of Tallarn cannot be understood without first examining the origins of the world itself and the strategic significance that made it a target in one of the most destructive campaigns of the Horus Heresy. Tallarn was an Imperial world located in the Segmentum Tempestus, situated in a relatively isolated stellar region that nevertheless held vital supply routes and access to significant deposits of natural resources. Prior to its devastation, Tallarn was classified as an agri-world, its fertile plains and expansive ecosystems serving as a breadbasket that supplied foodstuffs across neighbouring systems. The environment of Tallarn before its fall was defined by lush landscapes, open prairies, and stable climate cycles that supported an immense agricultural output. This prosperity, while mundane in its purpose, positioned Tallarn as an important logistical node in the wider imperial economy of the Great Crusade and early Imperium. When the Horus Heresy erupted, the Eye of Terror unleashed civil war across the galaxy. Legions of the Adeptus Astartes chose their sides, and worlds once thought secure became vulnerable overnight. Tallarn's fate was sealed when the Iron Warriors, the 4th Legion under the command of Perturabo, turned their attention to it. The Iron Warriors had long been the masters of siegecraft, fortification, and methodical warfare. During the Heresy, their campaigns were defined not by rapid strikes or sweeping maneuver, but by a relentless ability to reduce strongholds and bend landscapes to their strategic designs. For Tallarn, this approach would manifest in a campaign that did not merely seek conquest, but eradication. The initial objective of the Iron Warriors at Tallarn was tied to both logistics and ideology. Strategically, Tallarn contained hidden subterranean stockpiles and vaults belonging to the Mechanicum, many of which held archaeotech or war material vital to the Loyalist cause. These caches, though concealed, were known through the far-reaching intelligence networks of the Traitor forces. Perturabo recognized the value in denying such resources to the Emperor's forces. Ideologically, the destruction of Tallarn represented the 4th Legion's brutal practicality, to not merely conquer an enemy, but to render their strength useless. The opening act of the campaign was not an invasion in the traditional sense. Instead, the Iron Warriors employed a weapon of planetary annihilation, the Life Eater virus. This biological agent was among the deadliest of the Age of Strife, and had been preserved by the Imperium for extreme circumstances. Its effect was immediate and catastrophic. Upon release into Tallarn's atmosphere, the virus devoured all organic material at the molecular level. Flora and fauna alike perished in hours. Vast stretches of cropland collapsed into blackened decay, and the planetary ecosystem was obliterated in days. Once the virus had consumed its prey, the chemical aftermath triggered global firestorms, igniting what remained of Tallarn's biosphere and scouring the planet clean. What had once been a fertile agricultural paradise was reduced to a barren wasteland of ash, toxic winds, and irradiated deserts. The Iron Warriors believed that this act of extermination would secure their objectives without the need for prolonged conflict. The planet, stripped of life, would no longer sustain resistance. Yet, in a paradox emblematic of the heresy, the destruction did not end Tallarn's story. It transformed it. From the ashes of annihilation arose one of the largest armoured battles in human history, as Loyalist forces regrouped and fought for control of the devastated world. The biology and characteristics of Tallarn's people before the catastrophe are critical in understanding how they adapted to survive afterward. Prior to the virus bombing, the population of Tallarn was composed primarily of hardy agri-workers and settlers. Average height and build were consistent with baseline Imperial citizens, though generations of labour in agricultural environments had produced a population accustomed to physical endurance, with weathered skin from solar exposure and robust musculature from manual labour. Their skin tones varied across regions of the planet, from lighter shades in temperate zones to darker tones in equatorial farmlands. The planetary culture was pragmatic and closely tied to cycles of farming and resource management. Following the devastation, survivors who managed to find refuge underground in sealed bunkers or deep subterranean structures became the foundation of what would later be recognized as the Tallarn Desert Raiders. The shift in their biology was not evolutionary but adaptive, as generations raised in toxic, irradiated environments developed distinctive characteristics. Prolonged exposure to subterranean life, chemical residues, and survival under constant scarcity imprinted upon the people of Tallarn a leaner physiology. Protective gear became essential, and skin often bore the scars of exposure to residual toxins. Scar tissue, respiratory damage, and pale complexions became common among later survivors. Their eyes adapted culturally rather than biologically through the use of goggles, filters, and rebreathers, all of which became permanent elements of Tallarn identity. The military doctrine that emerged on Tallarn after the virus bombing was shaped by necessity. With the surface rendered uninhabitable for traditional habitation, warfare could no longer follow the patterns of open infantry maneuver or static fortification. Instead, the survivors turned to armoured warfare as both a means of survival and resistance. The Tallarn people reorganised their military around mobile tank columns, using subterranean caverns as staging grounds, and emerging onto the irradiated surface in swift, coordinated strikes. Tanks and armoured vehicles became both shield and weapon, protecting their crews from the hostile environment while delivering concentrated firepower against the entrenched Iron Warriors. The terrain itself dictated the tactics. Tallarn had become a desert world, with shifting dunes, irradiated wastelands, and the skeletal remains of agricultural infrastructure. Infantry movements were severely limited, as exposure to the surface meant certain death without full protective gear. Tanks, however, could traverse the open expanses, engage in long-range duels, and use speed to avoid counterstrikes. Thus, the survivors of Tallarn embraced armoured warfare with a zeal that would permanently define their military culture. Recruitment during this period was both a matter of survival and necessity. Every survivor who could operate machinery, maintain vehicles, or provide logistical support was pressed into service. Training was pragmatic, often taking place in underground shelters where simulators, captured data, or even oral instruction served as the only methods available. With resources scarce, Tallarn's commanders relied heavily on salvaging wrecks, repurposing Mechanicum relics, and making use of whatever armoured vehicles could be brought into service. Despite the limitations, this desperate adaptation proved effective. Tallarn's armoured regiments became feared for their endurance, cunning, and ability to fight effectively in the most hostile conditions imaginable. From a broader perspective, the transformation of Tallarn illustrates the resilience of human populations under catastrophic stress. A world that had been stripped of all natural wealth, annihilated by one of the most devastating biological weapons known, nevertheless rose to defy one of the most powerful traitor legions. The survivors forged a military identity that not only defined their immediate struggle, but echoed throughout the history of the Imperium. Tallarn Desert Raiders became synonymous with armoured warfare, desert survival, and an indomitable will to resist. The Iron Warriors' miscalculation was stark. By attempting to obliterate Tallarn, they instead created an environment where resistance could not only endure, but thrive under new conditions. The destruction of the biosphere stripped the Iron Warriors of their own advantages, forcing them into a prolonged conflict they had hoped to avoid. Instead of pacification, Tallarn became the site of the largest tank battle in human history, a protracted struggle that saw over 1 million armoured vehicles clash across a world reduced to dust and ruin. This foundational moment, the virus bombing, the survival of the Tallarn people, and the reorganisation of their military doctrine, marks the beginning of the story of the Battle of Tallarn. It was an event not defined solely by destruction, but by transformation, setting the stage for the immense and grinding conflict that would follow. The transformation of Tallarn into a desert wasteland fundamentally altered the way war was waged on the planet. While the virus bombing destroyed nearly all organic life, much of the Imperium's machinery and buried stockpiles remained intact. These stores, originally concealed by the Mechanicum or requisitioned by Imperial authorities during the Great Crusade, provided the foundation upon which Tallarn's surviving defenders built their resistance. Technology, once used to maintain agricultural output and infrastructure, was repurposed for war. At the same time, the Iron Warriors deployed their own formidable arsenal, ensuring that the conflict on Tallarn would evolve into the largest tank battle in human history. The vehicles employed in the Battle of Tallarn varied from the most common armoured transports to rare relics of the Mechanicum. The Leman Russ battle tank formed the backbone of the Imperial Guard armoured regiments, and Tallarn was no exception. Rugged, reliable, and designed to operate in hostile conditions, the Leman Russ was well suited to the irradiated deserts. Crews operated in sealed compartments, their life-sustaining systems shielding them from toxins and radioactive dust storms. Modifications were quickly introduced to adapt these tanks for desert conditions, including improved filtration systems and reinforced cooling units to prevent mechanical failure under the planet's intense heat. Supporting the Leman Russ were Chimera armoured transports, Basilisk artillery pieces, and the formidable Baneblade super heavy tanks. Each served a critical function in the protracted engagements across Tallarn. Chimeras transported infantry contingents when surface operations were unavoidable, though their role was diminished compared to more hospitable theatres. Basilisks, with their long-range Earthshaker cannons, provided essential indirect fire support, compensating for the limited mobility of infantry in the open desert. Baneblades, though few in number, became symbols of survival and resistance, their immense bulk shrugging off the punishing weapons of the Iron Warriors while delivering crushing firepower in return. Equally significant was the role of more specialised vehicles. Sentinels, normally employed for scouting, proved invaluable in navigating irradiated wastelands and tracking enemy armour formations. Hydra flak tanks, although designed for anti-aircraft warfare, were often used to provide suppressive fire against lighter Iron Warrior vehicles. In addition, Tallarn defenders made extensive use of Mechanicum relics recovered from hidden vaults, including rare variants of Land Raiders, Predators, and even experimental designs. These vehicles, remnants of earlier technological epochs, provided both a psychological and tactical edge, demonstrating that the defenders had access to tools the traitors had not anticipated. The Iron Warriors brought their own formidable arsenal. Siegecraft had long been their specialty, and they relied heavily on armoured columns designed to crush resistance through attrition. Their forces included Legion Predator tanks, Land Raiders, and Spartan assault tanks, all supported by artillery and mechanized infantry. Perturabo himself had ensured that the Tallarn campaign would be supplied with an overwhelming armoured force. What the Iron Warriors did not anticipate, however, was the protracted nature of the conflict and the attritional strain it would place upon their logistics. The technological style of Tallarn warfare during this period was utilitarian, marked by adaptation rather than innovation. Vehicles were rarely pristine. Desert sand and chemical storms scoured their armour, leaving pitted surfaces and scarred plating. Crews adorned their machines with crude markings to identify regiments and units, often painted hastily with whatever pigments could be scavenged. Functionality was always prioritised over appearance. Maintenance was constant. Every vehicle required significant attention to remain operational in the harsh environment. Crews became as much engineers as they were soldiers, capable of disassembling engines, replacing filtration systems, or improvising field repairs under fire. In terms of personal gear, the survivors of Tallarn developed a distinctive appearance. Protective clothing was mandatory, consisting of layered desert robes adapted into military uniforms, designed to shield against heat, sand, and radiation. Respirators and goggles were ever present, making Tallarn soldiers immediately recognizable across the Imperium. Even when deployed off-world in later centuries, the Desert Raiders retained this attire, a cultural legacy of the world's devastation. Personal weapons were standard Imperial Guard issue, including las guns, las pistols, and combat knives, though scarcity often forced units to rely on scavenged or modified weapons. Meltagans and plasma weaponry, effective against the armoured hulls of the Iron Warriors, were highly prized and reserved for specialised teams. The social structure of Tallarn after the virus bombing reflected the necessity of survival. Civilian life, as it had once been, ceased to exist. the population reorganized into military formations, with every able-bodied individual contributing to the war effort. Children were raised within subterranean shelters where martial training, survival skills and engineering knowledge were imparted as soon as they were capable of learning. Elders served as instructors, strategists or logisticians, ensuring that accumulated knowledge was preserved and passed down. Leadership was based less on heredity and more on demonstrated ability, though families who had held positions of authority in the agricultural past often retained influence. Values shifted profoundly in the wake of destruction. Where once Tallarn society had revolved around cycles of growth and harvest, it became defined by endurance, resistance, and the sanctity of survival. To endure hardship was not only expected but celebrated. Personal sacrifice for the greater good was honoured, and cowardice was reviled. Loyalty to comrades and to the cause of resisting the traitors became the foundation of Tallarn culture. These values would persist long after the heresy, embedding themselves into the regimental traditions of the Tallarn Desert Raiders. Leadership during the Battle of Tallarn was divided between Imperial Guard commanders, Mechanicum overseers, and at times Astartes advisors from loyalist legions. Coordination was not always perfect, but necessity forced collaboration. Tallarn commanders demonstrated remarkable ingenuity, often employing hit-and-run tactics, feigned retreats, and sudden armoured thrusts that exploited the environment to their advantage. The Iron Warriors, for all their power, struggled to anticipate these unconventional manoeuvres, which deviated sharply from the rigid doctrines they themselves employed. Civilian roles in this society of survival were inseparable from the military. Those not directly involved in combat served as mechanics, medics, scouts, or signal operators. Subterranean settlements functioned as both homes and military depots, with workshops dedicated to producing spare parts, purifying water, and maintaining life support systems. Entire communities were structured as auxiliary regiments, contributing to the wider war effort. Even cultural expressions adapted. Songs, stories, and oral traditions revolved around resistance and endurance, serving as both morale boosters and historical records. The Iron Warriors, in contrast, retained their traditional legion hierarchy. Command was centralized, with Perturabo's directives implemented through his captains and war council. Their organizational structure reflected their broader doctrine, methodical, hierarchical, and brutally efficient. Yet, on Tallarn, this very rigidity became a liability. The chaotic nature of desert warfare, combined with the resilience of the defenders, disrupted their preferred strategies of siege and fortification. The Iron Warriors found themselves forced into a battle of maneuver, a style of warfare that, while not beyond their capacity, was ill-suited to their cultural instincts. Technology and social organization intertwined in defining the conflict. Tallarn's survivors became inseparable from their machines, relying on them not merely as tools of war but as extensions of their environment. Tanks were not only weapons but shelters, means of transport and symbols of survival. To lose a vehicle was to lose not merely firepower but also a lifeline in the wasteland. Crews formed deep bonds with their machines, often referring to them with personal names or markings and maintaining them with near-religious dedication. The Iron Warriors, though similarly reliant on their vehicles, treated them as extensions of their wider war machine to be replaced when lost and maintained with cold efficiency. This distinction reflected the broader cultural divide between defenders fighting for survival and aggressors prosecuting a campaign of extermination. The values instilled during the Battle of Tallarn carried long-term significance for the Imperium. The Desert Raiders, as they came to be known, embodied principles of mobility, endurance, and cunning. Their cultural identity became permanently bound to the desert environment, even as they later fought on distant worlds. Tallarn regiments carried their desert gear, their armoured tactics, and their values into every conflict, ensuring that the legacy of Tallarn's destruction was never forgotten. The Battle of Tallarn thus represented more than a clash of machines. It was a conflict in which technology, society, and culture were forced to evolve under extreme duress. Vehicles became lifelines, leadership structures adapted to the demands of survival, and values shifted toward resilience and sacrifice. These elements combined to create a unique military culture that not only resisted the Iron Warriors, but endured across millennia of Imperial history. The Battle of Tallarn was not defined solely by technology or environment, but also by the individuals and units that shaped its course. Leaders on both sides directed vast formations, while soldiers and tank crews endured conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits. The clash between the Iron Warriors and the defenders of Tallarn brought together figures whose decisions carried consequences not only for the outcome of the battle, but also for the cultural legacy of the Imperium. Among the most notable leaders involved was Perturabo himself, the Primarch of the 4th Legion. His presence at Tallarn underscored the importance he placed upon the campaign. Perturabo was a figure defined by relentless logic, engineering mastery, and an obsession with siegecraft. His command style was methodical and rooted in calculated attrition. At Tallarn, he sought not only to deny the Loyalists access to Mechanicum stockpiles, but also to test the endurance of a population under total annihilation. His leadership ensured that the Iron Warriors brought overwhelming armoured might to the conflict, but his lack of appreciation for the adaptability of his foes proved a flaw. Perturabo directed the deployment of virus bombs and orchestrated the initial strategy, but the evolving resistance forced him into an extended battle of manoeuvre that ran contrary to his natural inclinations. Supporting Perturabo were his captains and war council, many of whom commanded armoured cohorts or artillery battalions. These commanders were veterans of the Great Crusade, accustomed to breaking fortresses and silencing resistance through sheer firepower. On Tallarn, however, their effectiveness was eroded by the defenders' ability to strike unpredictably and vanish into subterranean networks. The Iron Warriors, though disciplined, often found themselves frustrated by the evasive nature of their enemy. On the Loyalist side, leadership was less centralised. Imperial Guard officers, Mechanicum overseers, and elements of the Imperial Fists all played roles in coordinating the defence. One of the most significant figures was the Imperial Fist's Praetor Astra Militarum, whose arrival with Loyalist reinforcements provided a morale boost and an infusion of strategic expertise. The Imperial Fists, as masters of fortification, were initially ill-suited to desert manoeuvre warfare, but their discipline and organisational skills helped stabilise the defensive efforts. Karras and his subordinates emphasised coordination between disparate units, ensuring that armoured thrusts were not wasted in isolated attacks, but formed part of a coherent wider strategy. The Tallarn people themselves produced leaders of significance. Colonel Ahmad, later immortalised in regimental traditions, became known for his ability to rally tank crews and coordinate armoured formations under impossible circumstances. His emphasis on swift strikes, deep penetration raids, and the use of terrain for concealment became the hallmark of Tallarn doctrine. His leadership style was not rooted in grand speeches or displays of authority, but in pragmatic decision-making and a willingness to share the hardships of his troops. This approach fostered loyalty and resilience among his men. Units that fought at Tallarn earned reputations that endured long after the battle. The Tallarn armoured regiments, operating vast numbers of Leman Russ tanks, became the embodiment of desert resistance. Crews often operated in conditions that required them to remain sealed inside their machines for days at a time, eating preserved rations and enduring extreme heat within their armoured hulls. Their discipline and ingenuity allowed them to outlast better supplied foes. Certain regiments became legendary for their achievements, such as the 42nd Tallarn, known for executing a series of devastating ambushes that destroyed multiple Iron Warrior armoured columns in a single week. War machines themselves took on a symbolic significance. The Baneblades deployed on Tallarn became icons of defiance, their names etched into memory through oral tradition and regimental records. Vehicles such as Steelheart and the Emperor's Wrath were preserved through desperate maintenance, fighting on even when heavily damaged. These machines became as famous as their crews, with stories of their resilience passed down across generations. The Iron Warriors likewise deployed formidable engines of destruction, including fell blades and artillery pieces capable of reshaping terrain. Yet while the Iron Warriors' machines symbolized overwhelming force, the Tallarn vehicles represented endurance against annihilation. The sheer scale of the conflict on Tallarn demanded not only the vast deployment of infantry regiments and armoured brigades, but also the intervention of the god machines of the Titan legions. Few battlefields in the history of the Imperium saw such a concentration of armoured strength, and fewer still witnessed the full coordination of Baneblade companies and Warlord Titans operating side by side. The inclusion of the Collegia Titanica was not a mere show of force, it was a necessity born from the nature of the struggle. The Iron Warriors, entrenched in vast fortifications and shielded by corrupted engines of war, could not have been dislodged without the firepower and resilience of the Imperial Titans. For the commanders of the Imperial war effort, the Titans represented the ultimate weapon, one capable of shifting the balance of attrition in battles where even thousands of tanks might otherwise be ground to ruin. The Titans arrived on Tallarn in stages, as the Mechanicum and the Administratum coordinated their deployment through the labyrinthine logistics that characterized the entire campaign. The Legio Griffonicus, also known as the War Griffins, was among the earliest legios to commit their strength. Renowned for their honour and for their long service alongside the armies of the Great Crusade, their engines had fought on countless battlefields. On Tallarn, they were tasked with breaking through the most heavily fortified positions, places where even massed artillery bombardment and armoured assaults had failed to gain ground. Alongside them came elements of Legio Astorum, the Warp Runners, and the Tempestus, each contributing god engines that would walk the shattered surface of Tallarn in the long war of sieges and counter-sieges. The environment presented extraordinary challenges. The great dust seas of Tallarn were treacherous even for engines the size of hab blocks. Sandstorms cloaked the battlefield, reducing visibility and threatening to choke the delicate intakes and vents of plasma reactors. The crews of Titans were forced to adapt to a new kind of warfare, relying on Auspex readings, distant triangulation, and the guidance of smaller armoured columns to direct their fire. Entire battalions of armoured vehicles often acted as the outriders of Titans, ensuring no ambushes could cripple the god machines and securing routes that could bear the weight of hundreds of tons of walking metal. Even so, the sand seas claimed their toll, and more than one engine fell when its footing gave way beneath treacherous crusts of compacted dust. Despite the hazards, when the Titans marched, their effect was absolute. Battles that might otherwise have taken months of grinding attrition could be settled in hours under the gaze of a warlord Titan. Their weapons tore apart battlements, annihilated demon engines, and shattered iron warrior redoubts that had resisted all else. The sheer psychological effect upon the defenders was as significant as the destruction wrought. Traitor forces knew that wherever a Titan appeared, no ordinary defence could hold. In turn, the Iron Warriors, ever adaptive and unflinching, devised countermeasures to blunt the god engine's advance. Siege cannons were reconfigured to target void shields, entire trench networks were restructured into labyrinths designed to slow or misdirect Titan advances, and corrupted war machines were deployed to counter them. The most infamous clashes came when traitor Titans strode forth to meet their loyalist kin. Records from the Mechanicum describe in precise measured terms the devastation of Titan duels, yet the words fail to capture the awe such events inspired. Engines kilometers apart could hammer each other with weapons of unimaginable power, their void shields flaring and collapsing under the barrage. Cities already reduced to ruin by orbital bombardment were further annihilated in the crossfire. Infantry caught in the shadow of these battles had little recourse but to take cover, knowing that their own survival was entirely dependent on whether their god machine triumphed or fell. The duels between loyalist and traitor Titans became legendary episodes of the campaign, remembered long after Tallarn itself was reduced to an uninhabitable husk. Coordination between Titan legions and the Imperial Guard was far from simple. Many Guard commanders found themselves overwhelmed by the presence of the Collegia Titanica, A single Titan could alter the strategic calculus of an entire campaign, and with multiple engines deployed across Tallarn, entire operational theatres revolved around their actions. Friction often arose when guard officers felt their own forces were being relegated to secondary roles, relegated to merely supporting the Titans. Conversely, Princeps and Moderati sometimes bristled at being tied to the slow advance of armoured brigades, for a Titan's true strength lay in its freedom to manoeuvre, striking where its firepower could be most decisive. Despite these tensions, necessity enforced cooperation. Tank regiments learned to fight in tandem with Titans, screening them from ambushes and exploiting breaches opened by their weapons. In return, the God engines broke apart enemy strongholds that might otherwise have consumed entire divisions in futile attacks. The Mechanicum presence on Tallarn expanded considerably with the arrival of Titan forces. For the tech priests, every deployment of a God engine was a sacred event, a communion between man and machine on a scale beyond comprehension. Maintenance rituals grew longer as the war dragged on, for the constant abrasion of Tallarn's dust seas threatened to grind down even adamantine armour. The tech priests of Mars established colossal field forges to keep the engines operational, constructing sanctified bunkers filled with arcane machinery and entire cohorts of servitors tasked with performing endless repairs. To the Mechanicum, Tallarn became as much a test of devotion as of engineering. The survival of their god machines against such relentless environmental and enemy pressures was a triumph of their creed, proof of the Omnissiah's favour. The Iron Warriors understood the significance of the Titans as well as their loyalist foes. For them, the arrival of Imperial god engines was a challenge to their pride as siege masters. Perturabo himself, though not directly present, was said to have directed elements of the defence from afar, ensuring that countermeasures against Titans were prioritised in the planning of fortifications. Traitor Titan legions, already corrupted by the influence of chaos, marched under Iron Warrior banners, and their clashes with the Loyalists were among the most destructive episodes of the campaign. Some of these traitor engines bore the marks of the warp, their forms twisted and reshaped by the powers of chaos, until they no longer resembled the machines they once were. Their presence lent an unholy aspect to the conflict, as though the very gods of war themselves had taken to the battlefield. Over the course of the campaign, the role of the Titans shifted. In the early battles, they were deployed as spearheads, tasked with breaching enemy strongholds and shattering Iron Warrior lines. As the war dragged on, and the battlefield became a shifting morass of dust seas, their role became increasingly defensive, anchoring Imperial lines and preventing traitor breakthroughs. Titans were stationed at critical junctures, their immense firepower ensuring no enemy could advance without paying an impossible cost. In these later stages, their presence became more symbolic as well as practical, embodying the resilience of the Imperial war effort and the unbroken will of the Emperor's servants to reclaim Tallarn no matter the cost. The legacy of the Titan legions on Tallarn extended beyond the battlefield. Their participation in the war solidified their reputation as the ultimate arbiters of conflict, forces capable of tipping the scales in the most desperate circumstances. For the Guard veterans who fought alongside them, the memory of marching beneath their towering forms remained indelible, a reminder that even in the darkest of wars, the Imperium could call upon weapons of godlike power. For the Mechanicum, Tallarn became a demonstration of the unyielding faith that bound man and machine together, a war where the god engines endured the harshest tests imaginable and emerged triumphant, even if scarred and diminished. And for the Iron Warriors, the battles against the Titans served as proof of their own grim determination, for only against such overwhelming might could their legacy as masters of siege warfare be measured. When the war finally ground to its weary conclusion, the Titans stood among the last witnesses of the devastation. Their shadows fell across a world reduced to ash and dust, a planet whose very surface had been reshaped by the weapons they bore. The battle had proven their worth, but it had also underscored the cost of such wars. Entire cities had vanished in the crossfire of their duels, countless lives had been extinguished by weapons never meant to be wielded upon a human scale, and the planet itself had been forever transformed by their presence. The Titan legions of Tallarn returned to their forges carrying both honour and burden, their machine spirits scarred by the memories of a world consumed by war. Behavioural tendencies of both sides reflected their cultures. The Iron Warriors approached the battle with characteristic stoicism and a focus on attrition. Their morale was not defined by passion, but by discipline and fear of failure under Perturabo's gaze. They displayed little mercy and pursued their objectives with methodical determination. In contrast, the Tallarn defenders embodied adaptability. They were cautious yet opportunistic, striking where advantage could be found and withdrawing before the Iron Warriors could respond. This behaviour frustrated their foes but preserved their strength in a battle of survival. Rituals and ethics emerged in response to the conditions of war. Tallarn crews often performed pre-battle rites centred on their vehicles, offering prayers for mechanical endurance and the survival of their comrades. These practices were not derived from the Imperial cult as it would later become standardised, but from pragmatic traditions that elevated the bond between human and machine. Internal divisions existed on both sides. Within the Tallarn survivors, tensions sometimes arose between those of agricultural heritage and those tied to Mechanicum enclaves. The former emphasised preservation of cultural identity, while the latter prioritised technological efficiency. However, the demands of survival minimised these divisions, forcing cooperation. Within the Iron Warriors, internal rivalries between captains occasionally flared, driven by ambition or differing interpretations of Perturabo's orders. These divisions rarely surfaced openly, but they contributed to occasional lapses in coordination. The human cost of Tallarn was immense. Millions perished in the virus bombing, and millions more died in the subsequent armoured clashes. Yet, within this devastation, figures emerged whose leadership and sacrifice carried symbolic weight. The people of Tallarn became defined by their resistance, while the Iron Warriors were marked by their failure to achieve swift victory despite overwhelming power. The legacy of Tallarn's leaders, units, and war machines extended far beyond the battle itself. The Desert Raiders became a permanent fixture within the Imperial Guard, carrying forward traditions forged in the crucible of annihilation. Their rituals, ethics, and behavioural instincts reflected the lessons of survival against a Primarch's wrath. The Iron Warriors, though ultimately withdrawing, internalised the frustration of Tallarn as another scar in their long history of bitterness and attritional warfare. Perturabo's inability to crush the defenders despite total environmental destruction became a symbol of both the Legion's power and its limitations. The first chapter of Tallarn's story closes with the recognition that leadership, units, and values were as decisive as machines and environment. The defenders, through their adaptability and cultural transformation, forged an identity that would endure across millennia. The aggressors, despite their overwhelming might, revealed the limits of rigid doctrine when faced with human resilience. Tallarn thus stands as a testament not only to the scale of armoured warfare, but also to the enduring importance of leaders, rituals, and cultural values in shaping the outcome of war. The records of the Administratum and Mechanicus concerning the Battle of Tallarn provide a different perspective from that of oral tradition and regimental memory. To these institutions, Tallarn was not merely a battlefield, but a logistical event with implications for the Imperium's political, economic, and technological order. The vast paper trails of the Administratum and the encrypted archives of the Mechanicus both contain extensive documentation concerning the planet's destruction, the survival of its population, and the scale of material expended during the campaign. These records, often written in precise but detached language, reduce human endurance and sacrifice into figures, tables, and cross-referenced memoranda. Yet within these documents one may discern the competing priorities of two of the Imperium's most powerful bureaucratic arms. Administratum records begin with classification notices concerning Tallarn's pre-war status. Designated as an agri-world of second-tier priority, Tallarn's value to the Imperium was initially tied to its agricultural exports. Vast convoys of grain and processed foodstuffs departed the planet annually, supplying not only nearby systems but also contributing to the long-range provisioning of Imperial campaigns. Administratum logbooks note that prior to the virus bombing, Tallarn fulfilled quotas consistently, earning commendations for reliability. Its taxation level was set at a moderate rate, and its planetary governor was assessed as compliant with tithes and conscription requirements. From the perspective of the Administratum, Tallarn was considered stable, useful, and predictable. Mechanicus records, however, reveal a different appraisal. Beneath Tallarn's fertile surface lay subterranean vaults, stockpiles, and hidden repositories. Many of these caches were products of the Great Crusade, when Mechanicum expeditions deposited relics, experimental weaponry, and archaeotech upon worlds across the galaxy. Some of Tallarn's deeper vaults were sealed without record, accessible only to select tech priests who maintained ancient protocols. The Adeptus Mechanicus classified Tallarn not merely as an agri-world, but as a repository of strategic significance. These vaults were rarely referenced in open Administratum records, a deliberate obfuscation designed to protect their secrecy. Thus, when the Iron Warriors targeted Tallarn, they did so with knowledge that the Administratum did not fully possess, creating a divergence in bureaucratic awareness. The virus bombing of Tallarn is described in Administratum reports with detached phrasing. Official entries mark the event as total ecological loss and population reduction event. Figures estimate casualties in the billions, though later annotations note difficulty in accounting for exact losses due to the destruction of census archives and communication nodes. Administratum clerks attempted to cross-reference survivor reports with pre-war population estimates, but their figures vary widely, ranging from 3 to 7 billion dead. The bureaucratic phrasing reduces the annihilation of Tallarn's biosphere into statistical margins of error, but between the lines, the scale of the disaster becomes evident. The Mechanicus records are more technical. Virus dispersal patterns, firestorm ignition points, and the chemical transformation of the atmosphere are all meticulously logged. Their analyses conclude that the biosphere was irretrievably lost, yet they also note that certain deep vaults survived intact. Sealed behind reinforced barriers, these repositories withstood the virus and subsequent firestorms. Mechanicus adepts recorded relief at the survival of these caches, but also frustration that their presence drew traitor attention. For the Mechanicus, the destruction of the planet was secondary to the question of whether the relics remained recoverable. Cooperation between the Administratum and Mechanicus in the aftermath of the bombing was marked by tension. The Administratum sought to reclassify Tallarn from an agri-world to a war zone, amending tithe expectations and adjusting supply priorities accordingly. Internal memoranda circulated regarding whether Tallarn should be written off as a total loss, with some factions arguing that the planet's lack of agriculture rendered it valueless. Others insisted that its population, though decimated, still constituted a reservoir of potential recruits and logistical labour. Meanwhile, the Mechanicus resisted attempts to downgrade the planet's significance, arguing that the presence of archaeotech justified continued investment. The two institutions clashed over authority during the battle. Administratum officials attempted to impose order on the influx of supply requests, reinforcement demands, and casualty reports. They sought to maintain accurate records of regiments raised, losses sustained, and material consumed. However, the chaotic nature of Tallarn's subterranean war made precise accounting impossible. Tank regiments operated independently, often outside the reach of formal oversight. Administratum scribes complained of unverifiable engagements and unconfirmed strength estimates. Whole columns of vehicles would vanish into the desert, re-emerging weeks later with incomplete reports of their actions. For a bureaucracy that relied upon documentation, Tallarn represented a nightmare of uncertainty. Mechanicus adepts, by contrast, embraced the chaos as an opportunity to recover and deploy relic technologies. Their archives contain records of previously unknown tank variants pressed into service, some drawn from sealed vaults, and others hastily constructed from spare parts. To the Mechanicus, Tallarn became a proving ground. Experimental weapons were tested against the Iron Warriors, with results carefully logged. Reports note the field performance of modified plasma weapons, desert-adapted cooling systems, and filtration units capable of functioning in irradiated storms. Adepts recorded failures as readily as successes, with entire regiments lost when experimental systems malfunctioned. Yet the data was preserved, and Tallarn became a repository of technological field testing as much as a war zone. The political dimension of this relationship was complex. The Administratum, bound by hierarchy and procedure, insisted that Tallarn's tithe obligations and classifications be updated through the proper channels. Even as tanks clashed in the desert, clerks debated whether the world's new designation should be fallow, dead, or war tithe only. The Mechanicus, however, resisted such labels, insisting that Tallarn be considered a red priority world due to the presence of its vaults. This disagreement delayed certain supply shipments and reinforcements, as neither institution would concede precedence. Despite these conflicts, cooperation was unavoidable. Administratum convoys carried supplies through the warp, delivering munitions, replacement vehicles, and rations to surviving regiments. The Mechanicus oversaw their distribution and ensured the maintenance of equipment. Both sides recognized that without collaboration, the defense of Tallarn would collapse. Records note multiple agreements forged between Administratum and Mechanicus representatives, often brokered under duress. For example, in one notable instance, the Mechanicus granted access to sealed stockpiles of vehicles in exchange for Administratum guarantees that Tallarn's tithe burdens would be suspended indefinitely. Such agreements, though temporary, reveal the pragmatic politics that underpinned survival. Administratum assessments of the Iron Warriors' presence at Tallarn focus on logistics. Reports attempt to estimate the number of armoured vehicles fielded by the 4th Legion, often citing figures exceeding 1 million. Scribes note the difficulty of sustaining such forces in a hostile environment, recording shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. They observed that the Traitor's initial reliance on overwhelming force was gradually eroded by the strain of desert conditions. To the Administratum, the battle became a case study in how logistical constraints could undermine even the most formidable military power. Mechanicus assessments of the Iron Warriors are more technical. Adepts documented the performance of Legion war machines, noting their resilience and weaknesses. Predator tanks, Spartan assault vehicles, and land raiders were all logged, with attention paid to how they withstood the desert environment. Failures of cooling systems, breakdowns due to sand intrusion, and the corrosive effects of radiation were recorded meticulously. Adepts viewed the Iron Warriors not only as enemies but as subjects of study, with every destroyed vehicle offering an opportunity for analysis. The political undercurrent running through these records is evident. Administratum scribes sought to portray Tallarn as an example of bureaucratic resilience, emphasizing the continued flow of supplies and the eventual stabilization of regimental structures. Mechanicus adepts, by contrast, sought to portray the battle as proof of their technological indispensability, highlighting the role of experimental systems and recovered relics. Both institutions framed the battle in ways that reinforced their own authority within the Imperium. In reviewing these records, one observes not only the documentation of war, but also the bureaucratic competition that shaped its perception. Tallarn, in the eyes of the Administratum, was a logistical crisis that tested the endurance of supply networks. In the eyes of the Mechanicus, it was a battlefield laboratory where the survival of ancient technology determined the outcome. Between these perspectives lies the reality of a people struggling to endure annihilation, a fact often obscured by the detached phrasing of official records. The systematic analysis of the Battle of Tallarn within the archives of the Administratum and the Mechanicus reveals an intersection of two worlds of record-keeping. The Administratum sought to collate the human dimension, the organisation of regiments, the distribution of material, the tracking of losses, and the maintenance of morale through the recognition of sacrifice. The Mechanicus, by contrast, preserved an almost mechanical chronicle. Atmospheric compositions, resource depletion, radiation counts, machine spirit casualty reports, and the sequence of vehicle attrition. Together, these records construct a picture not only of a conflict of unprecedented scope, but of the logistical and technological machinery that sustained it. The first point of attention within the preserved administratum files is the extraordinary rate of escalation. When the initial virus and toxin bombardment scoured Tallarn, rendering the surface into a dead zone, the administratum was confronted with what might have been classified as a lost world. Early emergency reports from planetary governors were entered into the Departmentum Munitorum filing system under the category of exterminatus equivalent events. Yet even as evacuation protocols were raised, higher authority ordered the opposite, the retention of Tallarn as a viable battlefield. The cause was the intelligence intercepts suggesting the Iron Warrior's objective. Administratum notes preserved in the Lucid Archive series of Segmentum Tempestus record that the recovery of archaeotech sites beneath the planetary crust was deemed of sufficient strategic importance to nullify the classification of planetary loss. From that moment, Tallarn transitioned in the ledgers of the Munitorum from a world abandoned to a world requisitioned. Entire fleet schedules were adjusted to bring transport after transport of Astra Militarum regiments to Tallarn. Records show that within the first Terran month following the initial bombardment, no fewer than 200 regiments were committed. These were not dispatched simultaneously, but in waves, prioritized by availability, terrain specialization, and environmental survivability. The administratum made note of the high concentration of armoured regiments, including the Tallarn Desert Raiders, and many others adapted from death worlds or wastelands where survival in hostile conditions was routine. It is within these records that we find the first systemic evidence of how the battle transformed into the largest tank engagement in Imperial history. While infantry deployments are recorded in detail, many were effectively rendered support elements to armoured divisions. The Munitorum accounted for over 10,000 armoured fighting vehicles committed within the first wave alone, with requests for replacements being transmitted almost continuously from Tallarn command structures. The records show that losses were absorbed at an unsustainable rate, with the average operational lifespan of a Lehman Russ on Tallarn estimated at only 6 to 7 solar days before destruction or permanent immobilization. The Mechanicus archives reinforce and expand on this logistical picture. Martian cohorts attached to Tallarn filed detailed accounts of machine losses, treating each destroyed vehicle as a failed litany rather than a mere number. A compiled extract from the Collegia Titanica lists machine attrition in sequence, noting not only tanks and armoured carriers, but also the heavier god engines committed later in the campaign. According to these entries, even the mighty Warlord-class Titans suffered catastrophic structural degradation under Tallarn's shifting poisoned deserts. Reports describe collapsed reactor cores where the very sands of Tallarn, liquefied by earlier bombardments, swallowed the legs of Titans whole. The Mechanicus records also detail the technical measures employed to keep armoured forces operational. Engine seers on Tallarn developed improvised rituals for purging corrosive sand from intakes, for sealing hull breaches against toxic winds, and for sustaining machine spirits under continuous duress. These were recorded in the Annals of Emergency Right Application, Tallarn Theatre. One notable entry describes the field adaptation of coolant lines, normally designed for temperate climates, into reinforced systems layered with improvised insulative paste manufactured from locally harvested contaminated hydrocarbons. Such measures extended the lifespan of tanks by mere hours, yet these hours proved decisive in keeping armoured offensives rolling. The intersection of administratum and Mechanicus priorities becomes particularly visible in the matter of resource tracking. The administratum was concerned primarily with throughput, how many tanks could be delivered, how many crews could be rotated, how many ration packs could be distributed. The Mechanicus, meanwhile, catalogued resource expenditure in a more abstract sense: the energy yields of reactors, the entropy rates of replacement parts, and the cumulative effect of environmental degradation on material. From these parallel records, historians can infer the extraordinary logistical challenge of Tallarn. For instance, the administratum recorded that an average of 40 resupply convoys per day were dispatched into combat zones, while the Mechanicus calculated that 9 out of 10 vehicles arriving in these convoys would require immediate rites of restoration before they could even be engaged in battle. The Mechanicus also preserved detailed sensor data on the environmental aftermath of the virus and toxin bombardments. These records describe the atmosphere of Tallarn as a semi-permanent death shroud, with spore concentrations sufficient to corrode armor plating in under a week if left untreated. Radiation readings were categorized as cumulative fatal within 10 standard hours without sealed protection. Administratum notes confirm that entire cohorts of infantry deployed without sufficient filtration equipment were wiped out within days, leading to strict oversight of supply allocations. The Millennium thus imposed new requisition codes specifically for Tallarn. Sealed armour requisitioned as standard issue rather than as special equipment, ration supplements designed to counteract toxin exposure, and reinforced hab shelters to serve as temporary staging grounds. Mechanicus field logs also record the psychological effects on crews, which, though not central to Mechanicus doctrine, were observed as variables affecting machine efficiency. Repeated notes describe crew fatigue leading to improper initiation litanies, resulting in engine misfires or weapon malfunctions. To counteract this, engine seers implemented what they called ritual harmonics, essentially standardized chant cycles to discipline tank crews before battle. These were noted not as morale measures, but as stabilizing mechanisms for the proper engagement of machine spirits. Yet administratum addenda reveal that they inadvertently improved crew cohesion as well. As the battle escalated, the administratum struggled to reconcile the losses with the scale of reinforcements. In the muster logs of Tallarn, loss rates are recorded with the cold detachment typical of the Imperial bureaucracy. Regiments were not listed as destroyed, but as expended. Vehicles were transferred to the sands. The Mechanicus added its own terms, referring to destroyed war machines as silenced spirits. Yet even with such euphemisms, the figures were staggering. By the midpoint of the campaign, approximately 1 million Imperial soldiers were recorded as casualties, and the Mechanicus confirmed the destruction of over 10,000 armoured vehicles. Both record systems emphasise that this rate of attrition was offset only by the continuous reinforcement of fresh regiments, creating the peculiar dynamic of a battle in which neither side could achieve decisive breakthrough despite the mass committed. Further complicating these records is the evidence of conflicting priorities. Administrator memos emphasise the importance of denying Tallarn to the Iron Warriors regardless of cost, while Mechanicus communique stressed the preservation of archaeotech beneath the surface. There are preserved minutes of disputes between Munitorum logisticians and Mechanicus magi over whether to prioritise supply convoys for armoured regiments or excavation efforts near suspected archaeotech vaults. Ultimately, the compromise was reached only under direct intervention from higher Imperial authority. Offensive operations would proceed, but any discovery of archaeotech would take precedence over tactical considerations. This arrangement explains the otherwise puzzling diversion of entire regiments toward excavation duties during the height of battle. One particularly revealing set of records concerns the distribution of Titans. Administratum ledgers document the arrival of multiple maniples of god engines, yet Mechanicus entries indicate their combat deployment was tightly controlled and often restrained. While the Administratum desired overwhelming displays of firepower to rally morale and break enemy fortifications, the Mechanicus frequently withheld Titans, arguing that the sands of Tallarn were unsuitable for sustained deployment. This conflict of approach illustrates how the Imperium's bureaucratic and technological arms often worked at cross purposes, even within the same campaign. The scale of the Titan deployment on Tallarn was one of the most remarkable aspects of the battle, and the surviving records from both the Administratum and the Mechanicum provide a rare view into the logistical demands such war engines imposed. The data collated during and after the conflict speaks not only to the scope of the fighting, but to the extraordinary material burden carried by both the Loyalist and Traitor forces. The Battle of Tallarn is often remembered for the largest tank engagement in Imperial history, yet within this sea of armoured vehicles marched the Titan legions. Their presence required entire substructures of supply, maintenance, and coordination that stretched both Imperial and Traitor capacity to its limits. Administratum records describe the deployment of the Legio Tempestus, known as the Stormlords, as one of the earliest Imperial Titan formations to respond to Tallarn's defence. They were joined by detachments from the Legio Ignatum and later by elements of other Titan legions redeployed from distant war zones as the campaign escalated. On the opposing side, Perturabo directed the Legio Mortis and allied Traitor Titan legions to Tallarn, seeking to crush the Imperial defence with overwhelming god machines. The confrontation that followed was one of the few occasions during the Horus Heresy where multiple Titan legions clashed in direct, extended operations, supported by hundreds of thousands of armoured vehicles. The Administratum's tallies, drawn from fragmentary supply logs and campaign reports, demonstrate the extraordinary tonnage of material dedicated to sustaining even a handful of god machines. Each Titan required constant shipments of reactor fuel, ammunition for its colossal weapon systems, and spare parts produced or adapted within Mechanicum forge enclaves hastily established on Tallarn's surface. Loyalist records note that while armoured regiments could, in extremis, make do with cannibalised components from destroyed vehicles, Titan maintenance required a far more rigorous logistical system. The Mechanicum's presence was therefore indispensable. Temporary manufactoria were established within the cavernous subterranean shelters of Tallarn to provide repairs, plasma containment arrays, and replacement armour plating. These operations were conducted under conditions of continuous attack, with supply convoys often suffering heavy attrition before they could reach the god machines in need of resupply. On the Traitor side, the Mechanicum allies of Perturabo organised similar logistical structures, though their records are fragmentary and largely reconstructed from captured data crypts and intercepted Vox traffic. The Traitor Titan legions operated with greater initial reserves, as Perturabo had prepared his invasion with the intent of crushing Tallarn in a single overwhelming strike. However, the unexpected endurance of the Loyalists forced his forces into a war of attrition. Even Titans designed for apocalyptic shock assaults required extended maintenance cycles once the war bogged down into protracted armoured clashes. Traitor records indicate entire convoys of supply haulers dedicated solely to ferrying plasma reactor fuel and replacement void shield components. The strain of sustaining these supplies across the shattered deserts of Tallarn grew severe, and rivalries emerged between Traitor warlords over the prioritization of resupply shipments. The Mechanicum records also provide unique insight into the management of Titan crew survival. Princeps and Moderati, once interred within their god machines, could not be easily replaced. Administratum casualty rosters show that extensive resources were allocated to recovery operations aimed at extracting wounded crew members from damaged Titans, even when the machines themselves were deemed irrecoverable. The Mechanicum's Biological Support Corps maintained extensive medical facilities near operational bases, as the continuity of experienced Titan crews was considered of greater strategic importance than the replacement of the machines themselves. In this respect, Titan warfare at Tallarn was as much about sustaining irreplaceable human elements as it was about preserving the god machines. Both the Loyalist and Traitor records reflect the enormous impact of Tallarn's poisoned biosphere on Titan operations. Following Perturabo's virus bombing of the planet, the world's surface was a chemically unstable wasteland. Titans, while more resilient than tanks, still required extensive protective measures. Administratum records detail the allocation of entire divisions of servitors and labourers to construct specialised maintenance shelters with reinforced void shielding and sealed atmospherics to prevent chemical corrosion of Titan joints and weapon housings. The Mechanicum recorded a sharp increase in plasma containment failures and corrosion incidents, forcing constant expenditure of resources on preventative maintenance. The contaminated environment also complicated fuel production, forcing the Mechanicum to establish plasma conversion facilities deep underground, shielded from chemical storms that frequently swept across the battlefield. From the administrative standpoint, Titan legions were treated as separate logistical entities from armoured divisions. Despite fighting alongside them, tallies show that while a single armoured regiment could be supported by standard supply convoys, Titan deployments required priority allocation of orbital cargo landers and specialised transport crawlers capable of hauling reactor cores, void shield emitters, and replacement weapon barrels that spanned dozens of meters. The scale of these operations is captured in one surviving administrator memorandum, which notes that one god engine consumes in one day the supply burden of an armoured regiment in 1 week. This blunt calculation underscores why Titan engagements were not lightly undertaken by either side. Mechanicum records further emphasise the importance of synchronising Titan operations with the broader battlefield supply web. Titans could not operate in isolation. Their immense firepower had to be coordinated with armoured spearheads, and their supply chains intertwined with those of the wider war effort. Fuel convoys serving Titans were often escorted by armoured formations, and in many cases resupply points doubled as staging grounds for tank regiments. These interdependencies forced the administratum to adapt its record-keeping, with entire sections of Tallarn's campaign ledgers dedicated solely to coordinating Titan resupply timetables with the broader armoured war. Traitor records reveal a parallel picture. Perturabo's invasion plan had envisioned Titans as the decisive blow against Imperial resistance, yet the collapse of Tallarn's surface infrastructure rendered his logistical preparations less effective than anticipated. Titan resupply depots were often overrun by Imperial counterattacks, and the loss of even a single shipment of reactor fuel could immobilize multiple war engines. In some cases, Traitor Titans were forced to power down for weeks at a time, hidden within the poisoned wastelands until sufficient fuel could be brought forward. Administratum observers recorded these lulls in Traitor activity with care, adjusting loyalist operations to exploit them whenever possible. Perhaps the most telling detail preserved in Mechanicum archives is the extraordinary resource rivalry between Titan legions and armoured divisions. While both required fuel and munitions, Titan demands were so immense that they often diverted supplies away from frontline tank units. Imperial logisticians frequently complained that Titans consumed resources that could otherwise have supported dozens of armoured regiments. Nonetheless, the Mechanicum's position was that the strategic value of a Titan far outweighed any such trade-offs. Traitor records show similar disputes, with warlords of the Iron Warriors resenting the supply priority granted to Legio Mortis at the expense of their own armoured forces. Such tensions highlight the political as well as logistical strain imposed by Titan warfare. In the end, the logistical records of Tallarn's Titan legions capture the stark reality that god machines, for all their devastating might, were as dependent on the material structures of war as any other weapon. The administratum's careful tallies of fuel, ammunition and spare parts, combined with the Mechanicum's detailed accounts of reactor management, shield maintenance and component replacement, provide one of the clearest surviving studies of Titan warfare at scale during the Horus Heresy. They show a picture not of invulnerable engines striding without limit, but of war machines bound by the same attritional pressures that defined the wider battle. The clash of traitor and loyalist Titans at Tallarn was thus not only a contest of firepower, but a struggle of supply lines, manufactoria output, and the endurance of human and machine systems stretched to their limits. Without the vast administrative machinery of the Imperium and the tireless labours of the Mechanicum, the loyalist Titans could never have remained in the field. Without Perturabo's careful pre-invasion preparations, the Traitor Titans would have faltered even earlier. The logistical records stand as a testament that at Tallarn, as in so many wars of the Great Crusade and the Heresy, the fate of battle rested as much on the ledgers and manufactoria of the Imperium as on the guns of its armies. The question of victory and defeat is also framed differently within these records. Administratum files conclude that the Imperial forces achieved their strategic aim, denying Tallarn to the Iron Warriors and retaining it within the Imperial fold. Mechanicus accounts, however, view the outcome through the lens of preservation of knowledge. They note with concern that significant archaeotech remained undiscovered, and that portions of the subterranean vaults were destabilized beyond recovery due to the scale of the battle. Thus, where the Administratum closed the file on Tallarn as a hard-won triumph, the Mechanicus preserved it as a case study in partial failure, a reminder of what was lost even in apparent victory. Finally, it is important to note the durability of these records themselves. Administratum accounts of Tallarn exist in thousands of fragmented copies, distributed across multiple data vaults, often with inconsistencies in casualty figures and dates. Mechanicus records, by contrast, are preserved with near-total precision, but their highly technical format renders them difficult for non-Mechanicus archivists to interpret without contextual translation. The synthesis of both is what allows historians to reconstruct the campaign with some measure of coherence, though absolute certainty is impossible. This too is reflected in the Imperial archive practice. Administratum entries are stamped finalised, while Mechanicus entries are stamped ongoing review. The Battle of Tallarn, therefore, remains not only a colossal military confrontation, but also a case study in how the Imperium remembers war through its twin lenses of human bureaucracy and machine logic analysis. The records concerning the later stages of the war for Tallarn describe a grinding struggle that unfolded over years rather than weeks. In the earliest phases of the conflict, the surprise of the Iron Warriors' attack and the sudden poisoning of the planet created a state of total confusion. Administratum archives from this period remark upon the volume of requests for clarification that flooded from regimental officers, munitorum officials, and planetary authorities alike, as no precedent existed for an entire planet being rendered into an instant death world and then transformed into the site of the largest tank battle ever recorded. The official channels of the Imperium struggled to make sense of the event, and many of the first reports were so contradictory that later archivists simply discarded them. What emerges from the reconciled documents is an account of logistical improvisation on an unprecedented scale, where the survival of Tallarn's defenders depended upon the rapid coordination of military supply and mechanized assets under conditions that would normally make war impossible. The Adeptus Mechanicus records contribute a different perspective. Their interest was directed less toward the human scale of suffering and more toward the fate of the war machines committed to the battle. Forge Worlds and Mechanicus enclaves had long maintained stocks of armoured vehicles across the segmentum obscurus, but the sudden escalation of demand caused by Tallarn outstripped every calculated reserve. The Mechanicus responded by initiating emergency tithes of armour from neighbouring systems, recalling decades-old vehicles from storage, and even pulling incomplete chassis from half-finished production runs. Tech priests noted with some pride that vehicles long thought obsolete or unsuitable were pressed into service and functioned adequately on Tallarn's poisoned wastes. From their perspective, the Battle of Tallarn was not only a human catastrophe, but also a demonstration of the resilience of the Omnissiah's gifts. Administratum commentaries emphasize the difficulty of maintaining accurate tallies of both losses and reinforcements. Tallarn's surface was in a constant state of flux, with shifting sands, collapsing terrain, and lethal storms that destroyed Vox equipment and severed communications. Regiments that were reported destroyed sometimes reappeared months later, having fought in isolation and then re-established contact. Other formations that were believed intact vanished without explanation, either swallowed by the shifting deserts or annihilated in local engagements too small to be noticed at the scale of the overall conflict. The bureaucrats tasked with consolidating these reports frequently expressed frustration that any attempt to maintain an orderly register of the battle was undermined by the chaos of conditions. Even so, they continued to compile figures, their ledgers marked by countless annotations, corrections, and voided entries. The Mechanicus view was more detached, with their records describing the battle almost as a grand experiment in armoured warfare. They catalogued every modification applied in the field, every instance where crews adapted their tanks for survival in Tallarn's hostile environment. Filters were replaced with improvised systems scavenged from wrecks, engines were reconfigured to run on impure or contaminated fuels, and weapons were adapted to cope with the fine grit that infiltrated every opening. Tech adepts circulated across the battlefront not only to maintain machines but also to document their performance, often showing more concern for the fate of the vehicles than the soldiers who operated them. The Mechanicus concluded that Tallarn demonstrated the near-limitless adaptability of the standard template constructs upon which Imperial technology was based, a result they would later cite in arguments regarding the sanctity of ancient designs. Administratum and Mechanicus narratives converge on the sheer scale of the battle. The estimates recorded vary widely, but even conservative assessments describe millions of combatants and tens of thousands of armoured vehicles committed to the campaign. The notion of the largest tank battle in history is not simply rhetorical, but supported by comparative records. Neither before nor after Tallarn did the Imperium ever again see such a concentration of armoured forces deployed simultaneously. Administratum scribes who attempted to summarise the event often struggled with the immensity of the figures, their prose lapsing into repetition as they sought to emphasise that no metric of previous wars could be applied to Tallarn without distortion. Another recurring theme is the transformation of Tallarn society. Once an agri-world with established surface settlements and irrigation projects, Tallarn was reduced to a subterranean existence in a matter of days. The civilian population retreated into shelters, mines and storage vaults, relying upon rationed supplies and the protection of the Imperial Guard. Administratum accounts describe the planet's descent into silence, its once vibrant surface reduced to endless stretches of lifeless desert. In this environment, the tank became the dominant form of warfare not simply by choice but by necessity. Infantry operations were nearly impossible on the poisoned surface, and aerial warfare was limited by storms and toxins. The war therefore assumed a form where armoured columns became the primary vectors of movement, supply and offence. The Administratum later noted that Tallarn was unique in being a war where tanks did not support infantry, but instead acted as the main arm of the campaign, with infantry existing only to support the tanks. Mechanicus perspectives on this transformation are similarly recorded. The tech priests observed that Tallarn became an experimental theatre where every conceivable tank tactic was tested, refined, and countered. Ambushes, mobile defences, armoured spearheads and massed clashes all occurred in succession. Entire doctrines of armoured warfare were born, lived and died within the span of the conflict. The Mechanicus archives preserve schematic diagrams and tactical analyses compiled from recovered data slates and vehicle cogitators, presenting the battle as a sequence of evolving mechanical interactions rather than a human war. To them, Tallarn was not simply a defence of a world, but a record of how armoured warfare functioned at its theoretical limit. Administratum records also underscore the political dimension. The loss of Tallarn would not merely have been a local tragedy, but a strategic disaster. Its position in the segmentum made it a potential staging ground for further traitor incursions, and its transformation into a death world carried implications for food supply chains across Imperial space. Every reinforcement, every resupply, and every logistical adjustment made during the battle was weighed against wider considerations of resource allocation. The bureaucratic language of these documents reduces the immense suffering of Tallarn's people to lines of figures and ration calculations, but behind those abstractions lies the recognition that the planet's fall could not be permitted without grave consequences for the Imperium as a whole. Mechanicus documents bring forward another angle, the obsession with the vaults buried beneath Tallarn's sands. While Administratum papers treat these as rumours or strategic justifications, the Mechanicus archives contain veiled references suggesting that the Iron Warrior's assault was motivated by the pursuit of lost technology. Though the records are deliberately vague, with large sections redacted or expunged, there are repeated notations concerning sealed complexes, unidentified constructs, and recovered fragments that were quickly transferred off-world. The Mechanicus did not openly acknowledge what was discovered, but their records are consistent in implying that beneath the chaos of the war, the excavation and retrieval of forbidden knowledge was an ongoing parallel campaign. Both Administratum and Mechanicus narratives conclude with the recognition that the Imperium ultimately secured a defensive victory, but one purchased at immense cost. The Administratum emphasises the depletion of manpower, the staggering quantity of material expended, and the irreversible transformation of Tallarn into a barren world. The Mechanicus highlights the destruction and recovery of countless vehicles, the adaptation of technology under hostile conditions, and the mysteries unearthed in the process. Together, these records frame Tallarn not only as a battle of survival, but as a moment where the Imperium's institutions were forced to function at the very edge of their capacity. In the centuries that followed, the Battle of Tallarn was repeatedly revisited in official discourse. Administratum officials cited it in debates over the allocation of armoured forces, warning that no planetary defence could afford to ignore the possibility of total mechanized war. The Mechanicus held it up as proof of the Omnissiah's providence, a demonstration that even under the most extreme conditions, the holy designs endured. In both cases, the memory of Tallarn served not as a singular anomaly, but as a precedent, a record that could be summoned in argument whenever questions of logistics, technology, or survival were raised. What remains most striking in the compiled narrative is the impersonal tone. Where the voices of soldiers and civilians convey the horror of the war in personal testimony, the Administratum and Mechanicus accounts reduce the same events to abstractions. Tallarn becomes a ledger of losses and recoveries, a catalogue of vehicles and modifications, a series of resource transactions and doctrinal experiments. Yet in their very detachment, these records capture a different truth, that in the scale of the Imperium, even the greatest human tragedies are subsumed into the machinery of survival. Tallarn was remembered not only as the largest tank battle in history, but as a reminder that the Imperium endures not through sentiment, but through the relentless accumulation of data, the preservation of doctrine, and the repurposing of every resource, no matter how broken. The Inquisition's archives concerning the Battle of Tallarn are striking not for their volume but for their layered contradictions. Unlike the vast and systematic records of the Administratum or the Mechanicus, inquisitorial commentaries were compiled with purpose rather than completeness. Each entry is shaded by the ordo that produced it, reflecting priorities that often ran counter to one another. To the Ordo Hereticus, Tallarn was evidence of Horus's embrace of forbidden technologies and his willingness to weaponize the abominable. To the Ordo Xenos, the contaminated terrain and altered biosphere suggested alien interference, or at the very least the dangerous possibility of gene deviation emerging under such hostile conditions. For the Ordo Malleus, Tallarn stood as a faint but troubling resonance, a place where the warping of matter and will intersected with the desperation of mortals. To understand their collective impression requires accepting these overlaps. Tallarn was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible of imperial will, a symbol, and a site of suspicion. When the virus bombs were unleashed upon Tallarn, the Inquisition had no formal presence in the system. Its closest observers were agents embedded within Warmaster Horus's wider fleets prior to his rebellion, and others seeded within Imperial army units for routine vigilance. What survived into the record are fragmentary transmissions and retrospective compilations gathered decades later. The early reports are terse, but consistent in tone. The scale of the attack was judged excessive even by the context of the heresy. While virus bombing was not unknown, the destruction of an entire verdant world struck many inquisitorial commentators as a deliberate demonstration of cruelty rather than military necessity. To some in the Ordo Hereticus, this was a critical proof of Horus's spiritual corruption, a visible rejection of the Emperor's stewardship of mankind's worlds. Others judged it instead as a calculated terror weapon, intended to collapse Imperial resistance before it could form. That divergence, whether Tallarn's ruination was ideological or strategic, remained an unresolved debate in the archives for centuries after. As the war shifted from annihilation to ground engagement, the Inquisition's impressions grew more complex. Surviving Administratum communiques described the massed mustering of armoured regiments across the Imperium. These were later verified by inquisitorial surveyors, who concluded that Tallarn was not merely a battlefield but a proving ground for the resilience of the Imperial Guard under the most hostile conceivable conditions. This interpretation became central to inquisitorial discourse. Tallarn was both a near-apocalypse and an unanticipated affirmation of human adaptability. To the Ordo Hereticus, the fact that tens of thousands survived beneath the poisoned skies was evidence of divine providence. To the Ordo Xenos, the sheer scale of adaptation, gas masks, sealed vehicles, improvised subterranean cities, invited concerns about the genetic and cultural mutations such prolonged survival pressures might generate. and to the Order Malleus, there remained suspicion that the warp had left a lingering taint upon the soil, a curse born from such vast death that could never truly be purged. Relationships with other Imperial institutions formed a recurring theme in the Inquisition's Tallarn records. The Mechanicus, for instance, were both praised and scrutinised. On one hand, their logistical contributions to the armoured regiments were indispensable. Without their rapid deployment of engines of war, the planet would have fallen outright. On the other, the Inquisition noted unease at how eagerly the Mechanicus catalogued and experimented with the unique conditions of Tallarn's surface. Some reports speak of sealed vaults established beneath the deserts, where Mechanicus Magi conducted controlled studies of corrosion, vehicle endurance, and human survivability in chemically hostile environments. The Ordo Machinum within the Inquisition considered this bordering on opportunism, and more severe critics suggested it veered into techno-heresy. Nevertheless, such cooperation, uneasy though it was, ensured that the Guard maintained its momentum in a war of attrition. This duality, of reliance and distrust, was emblematic of Inquisition-Mechanicus relations throughout the conflict. Political entanglements are woven deeply into the Inquisition's record of Tallarn. The sheer scale of regimental contribution meant that dozens of planetary governors staked their reputations on the battle. Victory or even survival at Tallarn became a form of political capital, later leveraged in petitions to the High Lords of Terror. Inquisitorial records observe that many of these governors emphasized their sacrifice disproportionately, erasing the equal or greater contributions of rival worlds. This post-war jockeying for influence was noted with suspicion, for the Inquisition recognized the potential for opportunism to mask deeper heresies. While no direct cases of planetary rebellion were traced to this aftermath, the archives record several inquisitorial interrogations of governors and high officers whose loyalty was considered insufficiently clear. Tallarn thus became not only a military struggle, but also a crucible for political reputation, and the Inquisition was keen to ensure that the narrative of sacrifice did not become a mask for sedition. Conflicts and cooperation between the Inquisition and the Administratum were equally evident. The Administratum sought to memorialize Tallarn as an exemplar of sacrifice, a demonstration of the Guard's indomitable spirit. The Inquisition, however, resisted such simplification. While acknowledging the heroism of the soldiers, they recorded the logistical chaos, the unnecessary loss of life from misallocation of supplies, and the reckless political pressures that often overrode tactical prudence. Inquisitorial records emphasize that without clearer chains of command, and without the unifying desperation imposed by the planet's devastation, the Imperial forces might well have collapsed into infighting. This skepticism reveals a recurring inquisitorial theme. Tallarn was as much a warning as it was a victory. It demonstrated the Imperium's capacity to survive total war, but also highlighted the fragility of its systems under stress. Within the Inquisition itself, Tallarn generated internal disagreements that bordered on schism. The Ordo Hereticus considered the battle definitive proof of the dangers of traitor generals wielding apocalyptic weapons. They argued for stricter oversight of Imperial army stockpiles and tighter control of orbital bombardment capabilities. The Ordo Xenos, by contrast, devoted their concern to the long-term ecological and genetic consequences of the attack, fearing that exposure to the corrupted environment might, over generations, yield mutations mistaken for alien interference. The Ordo Malleus, less immediately involved, nevertheless pressed for ongoing surveillance of Tallarn for warp manifestations, noting that the death of millions in a single planetary breath was the kind of trauma the Immaterium often seized upon. These competing emphases occasionally produced friction when allocating inquisitorial resources, with agents clashing over priorities in both the field and the archives. Yet this conflict also ensured a more comprehensive understanding, as each Ordo interrogated the battle from its own perspective. The agreements that emerged from these disputes were rarely explicit but can be traced in policy shifts after the heresy. Records suggest that the Inquisition pressed for stricter quarantine protocols around virus-bombed worlds, a practice later formalized in certain sectors. They also appear to have influenced Mechanicus studies by insisting on oversight of Tallarn's sealed archives, though whether this oversight was meaningful or symbolic remains unclear. On the political level, inquisitors frequently intervened in post-war commemorations, curating the narrative to emphasize vigilance rather than triumphalism. In doing so, they sought to temper imperial pride with caution, ensuring that Tallarn's lesson was not diluted into mere propaganda. Cooperation also existed on a more immediate level during the battle itself. Inquisitorial agents embedded within guard regiments often acted as informal coordinators, ensuring that reports of supply shortages or tactical mismanagement reached higher command without being buried by bureaucratic inertia. This role, though unacknowledged in official records, was crucial in sustaining the endurance of the Guard across so many years of grinding warfare. In several cases, these interventions prevented the collapse of local offensives, preserving the fragile momentum of Imperial forces against Horus's army. Such moments of cooperation reveal an Inquisition less as distant overseers and more as active participants, shaping outcomes by subtle but decisive nudges. Yet, for all these layers of involvement, the dominant impression left by the Inquisition's records is one of unease. Tallarn was celebrated by the Imperium as the greatest tank battle in history, a saga of resilience. To the Inquisition, it remained a paradox, a victory carved from devastation so profound it bordered on annihilation. The planet was saved, yet ruined forever. The Guard proved their endurance, yet at a cost that nearly broke them. The Mechanicus advanced their knowledge, yet their motives remained suspect. Political reputations were made, yet at the risk of corruption. To the Inquisition, Tallarn was not simply a triumph, but a reminder of the Imperium's constant flirtation with disaster, its victories forever shadowed by the seeds of its own fragility. Thus the Inquisition's collective impression of Tallarn was neither celebratory nor condemnatory. It was wary, ambivalent, and deeply analytical. The battle was preserved in their archives not merely as an account of war, but as a study in the nature of the Imperium itself, resilient, fractured, opportunistic, and dependent on the thin line between survival and collapse. In this way, Tallarn became more than a memory of the heresy. It became a touchstone, an enduring example to which Inquisitors returned when judging the Imperium's readiness for the next great crisis. The Inquisition's appraisal of the Tallarn campaign was not limited to the aftermath of its environmental ruin or the logistical burdens of sustaining its armoured regiments. Internal memoranda and sealed correspondence reveal that the Inquisition viewed Tallarn as a test case for evaluating how Imperial institutions could adapt under extreme stress, and more importantly, how their cooperation, or failure to cooperate, might set precedents for future conflicts. The records show a level of scrutiny far beyond the usual after-action reports, for Tallarn was seen not merely as a battlefield, but as a theatre of political calibration. In the eyes of the Inquisition, the campaign provided lessons on how the Imperium might respond to future engagements against traitor legions or Xenos threats across equally hostile environments. The earliest evaluations from Ordo Hereticus observers centered on the uneasy relationship between the Departmentum Munitorum, the local planetary nobility, and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Each institution laid claim to Tallarn in a different form. The Munitorum saw it as a logistical anchor for tank warfare, the nobility as their ancestral inheritance, and the Mechanicus as a valuable vault of lost technologies buried beneath its sand-choked surface. The Hereticus files emphasize that during the campaign, these claims intersected in ways that threatened cohesion. Noble families, their holdings annihilated by virus bombardment, pressed for compensation or recognition of sacrifice. The Munitorum, in contrast, downplayed noble complaints, and instead emphasized Tallarn's transformation into a crucible of armoured warfare, a reputation that could be exploited to inspire guard regiments elsewhere. The Mechanicus added further complication by submitting independent claims of ownership over several destroyed manufactoria, declaring them holy sites requiring reclamation and protection under the Treaty of Mars. The Ordo Hereticus assessed these disputes not merely as bureaucratic infighting, but as potential fissures in imperial unity. Their commentary suggested that if such quarrels were not contained, the traitor forces might achieve indirectly what they had failed to accomplish on the battlefield, the fracturing of the Imperium's resolve. The Ordo Malleus documents, by contrast, focused less on administrative quarrels and more on the deeper spiritual implications of the conflict. The Tallarn campaign was not simply a massive armoured engagement in their eyes, but evidence of how quickly the material form of a world could be reduced to wasteland by the weapons of the traitor legions. To the Malleus, Tallarn became a demonstration of the long shadow cast by the Horus heresy centuries after its conclusion. Horus himself had been slain, yet the forces unleashed in his rebellion continued to poison worlds long after. The virus weapons that turned Tallarn into a desert graveyard were seen as proof of the enduring threat posed by forbidden technologies and demonic corruption. In Malleus records, Tallarn is described as a warning that any lapse in vigilance could allow traitor arsenals, dormant or hidden, to surface again, carrying devastation far beyond their immediate tactical value. Their commentary pressed for greater oversight into Imperial stockpiles of ancient ordnance, fearful that the weapons which destroyed Tallarn might still exist in hidden caches across the galaxy, waiting to be misused. The Ordo Xenos too found reason to take interest in Tallarn. Their records suggest unease with the environmental aftermath, as the ecological transformation left the world in a condition eerily similar to certain Xenos tomb worlds. Reports detail how Tallarn's surface conditions, scoured desert, buried ruins and residual toxins could provide future opportunities for alien infiltration or exploitation. Some Inquisitors drew parallels between Tallarn's post-bombardment state and Necron worlds, whose ruined, lifeless surfaces concealed labyrinthine depths. Others warned that Orc incursions could easily take root in such desolate terrain, as Orcs often thrived in scavenging the wreckage of large-scale wars. The Ordo Xenos memoranda do not suggest that such threats had yet materialized on Tallarn, but the comparisons alone were enough to justify long-term surveillance. To them, Tallarn represented not only a victory over traitor forces, but also a stage upon which future Xenos dangers might one day play out. One recurring theme across these records is the question of whether Tallarn was truly a victory or merely a costly stalemate. Official administratum histories recorded the campaign as a triumph. The Iron Warriors had been repelled, their hopes of seizing the vaults beneath Tallarn denied, yet inquisitorial notes reveal a more cautious tone. The cost in lives, the total environmental loss of the world, and the ongoing disputes between Imperial institutions raised questions about whether the strategic outcome justified the sacrifice. Some Inquisitors argued that Tallarn's true value lay not in the land itself, which was rendered nearly useless, but in the symbolism of Imperial resistance. By refusing to yield the world, the Imperium had denied Perturabo a psychological victory, reinforcing the idea that no Imperial world would willingly surrender, no matter how desolate. Others countered that such symbolic victories risked draining Imperial strength, for Tallarn had consumed vast resources which might have been directed elsewhere against traitor or alien threats. The debate in inquisitorial archives does not resolve neatly, but instead reflects a long-standing division in Inquisition thought: the tension between the necessity of symbolic defiance and the pragmatic calculation of survival. The Inquisition also examined the specific matter of cooperation between the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Astra Militarum during the Tallarn campaign. On paper, their coordination appeared to function. Mechanicus forces provided technical expertise, the Guards supplied manpower and tanks, yet the inquisitorial records describe repeated tensions beneath the surface. Mechanicus adepts were reluctant to share details of the vaults Perturabo sought, guarding information that could have streamlined defensive planning. The Guard command structure, meanwhile, distrusted Mechanicus' motives, suspecting that their allies were more concerned with salvaging ancient technologies than with the lives of Imperial soldiers. Inquisitorial interrogations of surviving commanders describe strained councils of war, where priorities clashed and decisions were delayed. That the Imperial defense succeeded despite these fractures was seen by some Inquisitors as a testament to sheer resilience rather than true unity. Others argued that these moments revealed a more dangerous precedent, that Imperial institutions, when confronted with crises, too often sought advantage for themselves rather than collective survival. Tallarn thus became a case study in the fragility of Imperial cooperation, a warning to be cited in future campaigns where Mechanicus and Guard forces would again be forced to share the field. The Inquisition's attention also extended to the question of Imperial propaganda. In the years following the campaign, Tallarn was celebrated as the largest armoured battle in Imperial history, a tale of tanks waging endless war across the dunes. Millennium reports frame the world as a symbol of perseverance, where even environmental annihilation could not break the resolve of the Emperor's servants. The Inquisition, however, evaluated these narratives with care. While propaganda was acknowledged as necessary for morale, inquisitorial observers warned against the risk of oversimplifying the story. The truth of Tallarn, the devastation of its environment, the political quarrels among Imperial factions, the staggering losses, was largely hidden from the wider population. Some inquisitors feared that this concealment could backfire if revealed, undermining trust in Imperial institutions. Others defended the practice, arguing that to expose the full extent of Tallarn's suffering would only sow despair. Ultimately, the Inquisition permitted the propaganda to continue, though notes suggest they maintained private archives to preserve the unvarnished reality for their own purposes. These dual narratives, public triumph and private caution, reveal how Tallarn became both a rallying cry and a warning, depending on one's vantage point. Among the most intriguing aspects of the Inquisition's Tallarn files are the repeated mentions of agreements and compromises struck during and after the campaign. Records indicate that certain Mechanicus factions received guarantees of limited autonomy over the excavation of Tallarn's buried vaults, despite the concerns of the Millennium. In exchange, Mechanicus forces pledged to assist in maintaining the armoured regiments stationed on the world, ensuring that Tallarn remained a viable staging ground for future warfare. Similarly, the nobility of Tallarn, though stripped of much of their power, were granted ceremonial roles in Imperial ceremonies, their heritage acknowledged to preserve local loyalty. These compromises reveal the Inquisition's hand at work, mediating disputes, smoothing over conflicts, and preserving a semblance of order. While none of these agreements appear dramatic, they highlight how the Inquisition functioned not merely as investigators or enforcers, but as political mediators, ensuring that the Imperium's machinery did not grind itself apart in the aftermath of crisis. The records also contain subtle hints of conflict between the Inquisition and the Ecclesiarchy regarding Tallarn's legacy. The Ecclesiarchy sought to frame Tallarn as a holy site, its survival a miracle of the Emperor's will. Shrines were erected, pilgrimages proposed, and sermons declared that the desert itself had become sanctified by the blood of martyrs. The Inquisition, however, expressed skepticism. While not opposing the Ecclesiarchy outright, several inquisitors noted that the transformation of Tallarn into a sacred site risked obscuring the practical lessons of the campaign. They feared that framing the battle in purely spiritual terms would diminish attention to its logistical, political, and strategic realities. Yet, in typical Imperial fashion, both narratives persisted in parallel, Tallarn as holy shrine and Tallarn as cautionary archive. The Inquisition tolerated the duality, but their records suggest an underlying unease with how the Imperium's institutions could manipulate memory for their own ends. In the end, Tallarn remained in the Inquisition's files as a world of paradoxes. It was both a triumph and a ruin, both a symbol of cooperation and a record of institutional division, both a site of faith and a locus of political negotiation. The Inquisition's narrative, unlike the triumphalist tones of the Administratum, was one of complexity and caution. To them, Tallarn was less a singular victory than a mirror held up to the Imperium itself, reflecting both its resilience and its fragility. Their records leave little doubt. While the Iron Warriors were defeated, the true legacy of Tallarn was the lesson that survival in the Imperium was not guaranteed by strength of arms alone, but by the delicate balance of institutions, politics, and faith. The closing years of the Tallarn campaign were never defined solely by the clash of tanks, the shifting lines of infantry, or the resource calculus of the Administratum and Mechanicus. For the Inquisition, Tallarn was remembered instead as a proving ground of ideology and authority, a world where competing interpretations of Imperial law and necessity intersected with the raw chaos of war. Records drawn from inquisitorial archives reveal not a unified narrative of victory, but a contested space of justification, caution, and hidden agendas that shaped the manner in which Tallarn's survival was recorded, debated, and ultimately constrained within the Imperium's historical memory. From the earliest stages of the conflict, inquisitorial representatives had kept their distance. The initial orbital devastation by the Iron Warriors had been so severe that the planet itself was deemed of questionable strategic value. When the Mechanicus petitioned for oversight and the Departamento Munitorum pushed to marshal new reserves, the Inquisition maintained silence, preferring to allow the natural processes of Imperial military response to unfold. Only when it became evident that Tallarn's defenders were holding out and that the Iron Warriors' persistence pointed to hidden objectives, did the first serious inquisitorial delegations appear in theatre. These agents arrived not as generals but as auditors, quietly embedding themselves within command structures to gather information on the true nature of the conflict. The prevailing interpretation among Ordo Hereticus representatives was that Tallarn might become a precedent for planetary contamination by non-biological means. Unlike the demon-tainted worlds of previous campaigns, Tallarn had been rendered hostile not by warp incursion, but by a fusion of conventional and esoteric weapons. The virus bombs that stripped Tallarn's surface were seen as more than just weapons of mass destruction. They represented a method by which chaos might redefine the balance of warfare, making entire planets vulnerable without direct occupation. For this reason, Hereticus records lingered extensively on the implications of allowing Tallarn to remain settled. Could a world whose biosphere had been fundamentally altered still serve the Imperium as a viable, stable population base, or was the continued habitation itself an affront to doctrinal purity? The Ordo Xenos entered the discussion from a different perspective. While they had no interest in condemning the planetary population outright, their agents suspected that the Iron Warriors' obsession with Tallarn's subterranean vaults was not purely strategic, but linked to Xenos-derived technologies or ancient war engines. Reports filtered through inquisitorial circles regarding the buried repositories unearthed by the siege, relics that were later associated with pre-Imperial constructs and possibly Necron-related designs. For the Xenos Inquisition, Tallarn became a case study in the dangers of prolonged excavation in contaminated environments. Not only had the Mechanicus uncovered artifacts under duress and without sanction, but they had done so amidst a war zone, ensuring that oversight was minimal and the potential for compromise maximal. The Ordo Malleus, by contrast, viewed the Iron Warriors' actions through the lens of chaos corruption. Their agents noted that Perturabo's forces had invested immense resources in a world that had, on the surface, little to offer. To them, this implied not merely strategic intent, but an alignment with the darker ambitions of the Warp. The Inquisition's most secretive communiques emphasized the likelihood that the Iron Warriors sought not to secure Tallarn's mineral wealth or industrial remnants, but to harness deeper secrets tied to the fabric of reality itself. Rumours persisted that the extensive labyrinths beneath Tallarn had been sites of forbidden research, either in the Dark Age of technology or in lost epochs predating even that. Whether true or exaggerated, the suggestion was enough to warrant a Malleus presence, ensuring that if any warp-tainted construct were uncovered, it would not remain in Mechanicus or Munitorum hands for long. As the campaign reached its height, inquisitorial influence grew sharper. Agents began to shape the tone of military directives, urging certain regiments to pursue containment actions rather than outright offensives. A number of tactical withdrawals, criticised at the time as signs of weakness, were later traced to inquisitorial insistence that battle lines be adjusted to safeguard vault sites or deny the Mechanicus unmonitored access to specific excavation zones. This interplay bred friction between the Inquisition and both the Administratum and the Mechanicus. While Munitorum overseers demanded efficient annihilation of the enemy, Inquisition envoys quietly redirected resources towards surveillance and documentation. In several cases, regiments were kept idle not out of negligence, but because they had been seconded to unrecorded inquisitorial observation duties. Relations with the Adeptus Mechanicus proved especially strained. Where the priesthood saw Tallarn as a forge of opportunity, a world where forgotten technologies might be retrieved and catalogued, the Inquisition saw risk. Tensions flared over the ownership of artifacts retrieved from beneath the sands. Many such items disappeared into inquisitorial custody without passing through official Mechanicus archives. Adepts protested the seizures, but the Inquisition argued that matters of xenos or heretical taint superseded standard rights of salvage. The result was a protracted contest of wills, played out under the shadow of a campaign that demanded nominal unity. In public, the Mechanicus and Inquisition affirmed their mutual loyalty to the Emperor. In private, each manoeuvred to assert dominance over Tallarn's legacy. The political engagements following the Iron Warriors' withdrawal illustrate how these tensions resolved into a form of imposed consensus. Once Perturabo's forces abandoned their pursuit and Tallarn's defenders declared the planet secure, the Inquisition immediately initiated a comprehensive sealing of the records. Whole categories of information concerning the number of subterranean complexes, the volume of artifacts retrieved, and the precise losses sustained in specific vault battles were erased or reassigned under higher clearance levels. Civilian survivors were never permitted access to full accounts, and even Guard veterans who had served at Tallarn found themselves subject to oaths of silence, enforced under threat of inquisitorial sanction. The Inquisition also acted to redefine Tallarn's image in the Imperial consciousness. Rather than presenting it as a world teetering on the edge of ruin, they emphasized its resilience, shaping propaganda to depict Tallarn as a model of Imperial endurance. The narrative of endless tank battles across poisoned deserts was not only convenient but useful. It glorified the Guard, validated the sacrifice of billions, and shifted attention away from the secrets buried beneath the sands. In this way, the Inquisition transformed Tallarn from a cautionary tale into an exemplar of loyalty, ensuring that the broader populace would never question why the Iron Warriors had invested so much in an apparently worthless world. Conflicts with other Imperial institutions did not vanish with the war's end. In the centuries that followed, disputes periodically resurfaced over Tallarn's vaults. Inquisitorial claims remained superior, yet the Mechanicus continued to push for recognition of its excavations, while administratum clerks attempted to reconcile inconsistent reports. These disputes never fully resolved, for each organization interpreted Tallarn through its own lens of necessity. For the Mechanicus, a forge of knowledge; for the Munitorum, a grave of logistics; for the Inquisition, a theatre of hidden dangers that demanded perpetual vigilance. Cooperation, however, did emerge when necessity demanded. Inquisitorial writs permitted limited Mechanicus oversight under closely monitored frameworks, ensuring that research on Tallarn's relics could continue in controlled fashion. Administratum officials, for their part, accepted heavily redacted reports as sufficient for record-keeping, recognizing that complete transparency was impossible in an environment so politically charged. What persisted was a fragile balance, conflict contained by the shared recognition that Tallarn, though scarred, remained an integral symbol of the Imperium's survival in the face of chaos. In conclusion, the Inquisition's records cast the Battle of Tallarn not only as a military confrontation, but as a struggle over interpretation. Where soldiers remembered duels of steel and fire, and where clerks tallied supplies and lives, the Inquisition remembered Tallarn as a battlefield of meaning. It was a place where the Imperium's great institutions collided, where secrecy was valued over clarity, and where victory was measured not in territory reclaimed, but in control over knowledge. In their eyes, Tallarn was less a planet saved than a question managed, a site where the Imperium proved not only that it could withstand the assault of chaos, but that it could bury the truths such assaults might reveal.